Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're coming close to the end of Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah. We pick up today in Siman Reish Pei Ches. In this video we're going to learn Mirz Hashem Daf Kuf Nun Beis Amid Beis. We pick up on the bottom line of Kuf Nun Beis Amid Aleph. Siman Reish Pei Ches Sif Hey. Now Sif Hey happens to be quite a complicated sif, but we'll try to make it a little bit simple. The Mechaber is going to discuss the Shaila. We know already from all of our discussions that there are essentially two different days of Purim. There's Yud Daled Adar, which we know just as Purim, and there's Tezvav that we know as Shushan Purim. Who celebrates Yud Daled Adar? Just about everybody. Who celebrates Tezvav as Purim? People who live in an ir mukav chayma mimais Yeshua ben Nun. Anybody who lives in a city surrounded by a wall from the days of Yeshua ben Nun, they keep Purim on Tezvav. Now, we've learned that there are a couple of prerequisites, what type of city, etc., etc. But as a general rule, on a what we call a krach, that's an ir hamukav chayma mimais Yeshua ben Nun, they lay in the Megillah, they keep the mitzvah sayayim of Purim on Tezvav Adar. A regular ir, or a kfar, a village, a town, even an ir, a large city, if it's an open city, it's a prozi, it's an open city, they keep Purim on Yud Daled Adar. Now the question becomes, what happens if you have somebody who lives in an ir, a ben ir, somebody who lives in a regular open city? So for him, the chiyuv of Purim is on Yud Daled. But what happens if he's traveling? What happens if he travels to a krach? And now he's in a krach on Purim. So on Purim, he's going to be in a krach where the chiyuv of Purim is Tezvav. Or how about vice versa? How about if a ben krach, somebody who lives in a walled city, so his chiyuv is usually on Tezvav, he travels to a prozi. He travels to an open city, and he's going to be in an open city on Yud Daled when the chiyuv is on Yud Daled. What's the halacha in that case? When do those people keep Purim? Now we're going to see that as a general rule, there's a very interesting thing when it comes to Purim. You are considered a toshav, you're considered a resident of the city that you're in on Purim. So even if you're only going to be there one day, you're a ben krach. You live in a walled city. So all the years you keep Purim on Tezvav. But this particular year, you're traveling to visit your uncle in a prozi. You're traveling on Tainus Esther, on Yud Gimel Adar. You're traveling to a prozi, to an open city, and you're going to be in that open city, Yud Gimel, Yud Daled, maybe even Tezvav. You're going to be in that city. So you're traveling to an ir. You're traveling to a prozi on Purim. You're traveling maybe Tainus Esther, but you're going to be there on Purim. And when you go to travel on Tainus Esther, you know that you're going to be there for Purim. The halacha is that for this Purim, you are a prozi. For this Purim, you're considered a toshav of that open city, and you keep Purim like the rest of the open city. You keep Purim on your Daled that year, not on Tezvav. The same thing is the other way. Let's say you're a ben ir. You live in a prozi. All the years you always keep Purim on your Daled. This year you're going to visit relatives in a krach. You're going to visit relatives in an open city. So on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, whenever it is, you go ahead and you travel to a krach. You travel to a walled city. And you know that you're going to be in that walled city on Tezvav. On Purim, you're going to be in that walled city. Okay? You go, you get there, you're there, you're Daled. Your Daled doesn't mean anything to you this year. Even though normally you keep Purim on your Daled, but this year, you're a ben krach. Since you're intending on being in the krach, and you're in the krach for Tezvav, so Purim this year for you is Tezvav, and you're going to keep Purim on Shushan Purim. That's the general rule. But the shaila comes up, what happens if, A, your plans changed? Maybe you're a ben krach, and you went ahead and you traveled to a kvar, you traveled to an ir, you traveled to an open city, and your plan was that you were going to be in that open city on Purim, but you ended up going back to the krach while it was still Purim. You ended up going back to the krach. What happens if you're in one type of city for part of the day, the other type of city for another part of the day? This is where it starts to get complicated. So let's take a look here at the Mechaber, and we're really going to have to pay very careful attention to the Mishnah Berurah, because the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain to us how we're supposed to read and understand the Mechaber. But before we even get to the Mechaber, I want to start by reading a very unusual Biur Halacha. And that is on Kuf Nun Beis Amud Aleph, Biur Halacha Divrei HaMaschil Ben Ir Shehalach Lekrach. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Sif Zeh, this Sif in the Mechaber, Rabu Pe'eroisav Ma'oid. It has a tremendous amount of complications. Ayin B'Pri Megadim U'B'Shari Achronim. And to see some of those complications, he says, take a look at the Pri Megadim and other Achronim. The Takti b'Mishnah Berurah, when I wrote the Mishnah Berurah on this Sif, says the Chavetz Chaim, Rak Shitas Rashi, I'm basing it on the Shita of Rashi. Sheheskimu aleha harbe Rishonim. Many Rishonim agree with the approach of Rashi to this sugya, and when I wrote the Mishnah Berurah, I focused on Rashi. V'gam zeh bekitzer nimratz. And even what I wrote in the Mishnah Berurah, I condensed it very, very much. I wrote it very much bekitzer. And here's an astonishing line in the Biur Halacha. Umikol makom, nevertheless, after we're going to see this whole lengthy Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Beis, umikol makom, lamaisa, when it comes to halacha lamaisa, says the Chavetz Chaim, ani mevakesh mehakoreh, I am requesting of the one who reads the Mishnah Berurah, shelo yismach alai le'inyan bracha. Do not rely on me. Do not rely on what I wrote in the Mishnah Berurah le'inyan bracha. When it comes to the question of making a bracha on Mikra Megillah, don't rely on what I wrote in the Mishnah Berurah. V'ya'ayin b'Pri Megadim, look through the Pri Megadim. V'ayin b'Shiltei Giborim, look through the Shiltei Giborim. U'b'Biur HaGra, and take a look at the Biur HaGra. Shehetiku divrei Yerushalmi ledina, they bring down the Yerushalmi's shita when it comes to halacha l'maisa, which is sheben ir sha'akar dirasai b'leil tesvav, somebody who lives in an open city, if he leaves on the night of tesvav, v'halach lo lekrach, so Matzoi Purim for him. He's a Ben Ir, so his Purim is on Yud Daled. Now, Matzoi Purim, that's going into Shushan Purim, he left and he goes to a krach, and is chayiv kan v'kan. He's chayiv to have kept Purim on Yud Daled the previous day when he was at home, and now he's chayiv to keep Purim again on the next day on Tezvav when he's going to be in the krach. And that's not what's going to come out from the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Katan Yud Beis. So the Chavetz Chaim makes this astonishing request: do not rely on me when it comes to making a bracha on Mikra Megillah. He kind of says, do your own iyun, ask your LOR if it comes to a shaila of halacha l'maisa. So with that preface, let's go back to the bottom line of Kuf Nun Beis Amud Aleph, and let's take a look at the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, Ben Ir shahalach lekrach. You have a Ben Ir, somebody who lives in an open city. So when is Purim for him typically? On Yud Daled Adar, regular Purim. So Ben Ir, you have this person who lives in an open city, shahalach lekrach, and he traveled to a walled city. He traveled now to a walled city where they keep Purim on Tezvav. Or alternatively, says the Mechaber, you may have the opposite case. Ben Krach, you have somebody who lives in a walled city, so typically he keeps Purim on what we call Shushan Purim. Typically he keeps Purim on Tezvav, Shahalach le'ir. And this year, he traveled to an ir. He traveled to an open city where they keep Purim on Yud Daled. Now, obviously it means that he traveled to an open city before Yud Daled. So in both of these cases, let's assume for matters of simplicity, let's assume that the traveling is taking place on Tainus Esther. The traveling is taking place on Yud Gimel. So we have two cases here. The first case is we have a Ben Ir. We have somebody who lives in an open city who usually keeps Purim on Yud Daled, and he went ahead and he traveled to a krach. So on Yud Gimel, he left his open city, and he went and he traveled to a walled city on Yud Gimel. So he arrives in a walled city on Yud Gimel. Or Ben Krach, you have somebody who lives in a walled city. Shahalach Le'ir, he went to an open city, and he arrived in an open city on Yud Gimel. So each one of them are now located in the other type of city. The Ben Ir, who usually keeps Purim on Yud Daled, is now located in a krach that keeps Purim on Tezvav. The Ben Krach, who usually keeps Purim on Tezvav, is now located in an Ir that always keeps Purim on Yud Daled. What's the halacha? What do they do? Says the Mechaber, Kuf Nun Beis Amud Beis, Im haya daitai lachzer limekaymai. If when they traveled, okay, remember they traveled on Yud Gimel. When they traveled, they had in mind to return back home bisman kriya. Now this is the catch. We have to be very careful. The way the Mishnah Berurah understands this is, Im hayadaitai lachzar limekaymai. If this person's kavana was to go back home, and again, for purposes of simplicity, I'm going to pick on one of the cases that we just had. Let's focus on the case of the Ben Ir Shahalach Lekrach. This is the guy who lives in an open city, and on Yud Gimel, he traveled to a closed city. Now, says the Mechaber, if he was planning to go back to his open city, and he was going to be back in his open city when? Bisman Kriya, at the time of Mikra Megillah, of where he is now. He is a Ben Ir. He lives in an open city. On Yud Gimel, he traveled to a closed city. But his das was that he's going to be in the walled city when? He's going to be in the walled city on Yud Gimel. He's going to be in the walled city on Yud Daled. But Matzah Yud Daled, he's going back home to his open city. So he's not going to be in the walled city when the Zman of Mikra Megillah on the walled city's Purim morning, Tesvav in the morning, that's the walled city's Purim morning, he's not going to be there at that time. So again, he is a Ben Ir. He always lanes Megillah when? On the 14th. On the 13th, he went to a krach. On the 13th, he went to a walled city. But he knew that he's going to be back home by his Matzah Purim. Matzah Yud Daled, he's going to be back home. So he's not going to be in the krach Tesvav in the morning. Tesvav in the morning, that the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, is the Iker Zman Mikra Megillah for a krach. Yes, you lane Megillah at night also. So the night Yud Daled going into Tesvav, the krach lanes Megillah. That's the nighttime laning of Megillah for the krach. That's not the Iker Zman of Mikra Megillah, says the Mishnah Berurah. The Iker Zman of Mikra Megillah is the Zman of the morning Mikra Megillah. So here you have a Ben Ir who traveled to a krach, but he's not planning on being in the krach at the Iker Zman of Mikra Megillah for the krach, which is Tesvav in the morning. That's what these words in the Mechaber mean. If he had in mind to return back home, Bizman Kriya, before the time, before the Iker Zman of Kriyas Megillah, where he is now, in his destination, where he traveled to, not in his hometown. And then a strange thing happened. V'nisakev, he got held up. V'loy chazar, and he wasn't able to go home. So again, you have a Ben Ir, somebody who lives in an open city. On Yud Gimel, he traveled to a krach. His plan was that he's going to be in the krach for Yud Daled. But Matzah Yudalid, he's going back home to his open city. But then a strange thing happened. He missed his car ride on Matzah Yudalid. And now it turns out that Tes Vav in the morning, he's still in the krach. Guess what? Kairei kimekaimai. He still lanes Megillah according to the minig of his hometown. Since when he left his hometown and he traveled to the other city, in the case that I'm giving you, when he left his ear, when he left his open city, his intent was he's leaving the open city, but he's going to be back home in the open city before Tes Vav in the morning arrives. He never got the din of being a resident of the krach. In order to get the din of a resident of the krach, you have to be in the krach at the Iker Zman Mikra Megillah of the krach with intent. So, let's change the case a little. If what he did was he left his open city and he went traveling to a krach with the intent that he was going to be in the krach Tes Vav morning, and now when Tes Vav morning comes, he indeed is in the krach, then he has the din of a toishav of the krach. Then, Yodalid, he wasn't supposed to do anything. Yodalid wasn't Purim for him. He is now a ben krach. He left his ear, he went to a krach with the intent of being in the krach on Tes Vav in the morning, at the Zman of Mikra Megillah for the Bnei HaKrach. He has the din of a toishav of the krach. His Purim that year is on Tes Vav. But if he left the ear and he traveled with the krach to the krach with the intent of not being in the krach at Tes Vav in the morning, then he's not a toishav of the krach, even if he ends up being in the krach on Tes Vav in the morning. He has to keep Purim on Yudalid in the krach. He has to keep Purim on Yudalid because he did not become a toishav of the krach. Says the Mechaber weiter, and we're going to chazer iber all of this in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber weiter, V'im lo haya b'daitoi lachzor ela la'achar zman hakriya. But, like I just told you, if when he traveled, he did not have in mind to go back to his hometown before the Zman of Mikra Megillah arrives where he is, ela la'achar zman hakriya. So let's say the ben krach. A ben krach went to an ear. A ben krach traveled to an open city. And he had in mind that he was going to be in the open city Yud Dalet in the morning. Yud Dalet in the morning is the Iker Zman Mikra Megillah for an ear. So this ben krach went to an ear, and he had in mind that he's going to be in the ear Yud Dalet in the morning at the Iker Zman Mikra Megillah. He becomes a ben ear. He has to lane the Megillah like the Bnei Ha'ir. He has to lane Yud Dalet in the morning. So says the Mechaber. So what did we glean from the Mechaber over here? What we see from the Mechaber is like this. If you're a ben krach and you travel to an ear, but you're intending on being in the ear on Purim, so Yud Dalet in the morning, you're in the ear. For this year, you're a Bnei Ha'ir. You're a ben ear. You lane and you keep Purim on Yud Dalet. But if you're a ben krach and you went to an ear, so on Yud Gimel, you went to a city, but you are intending on going back home, Motzei Tainis Esther. You are not planning on being in the ear at Alois HaShachar, Yud Dalet in the morning. That's when the Zman Mikra Megillah of the morning for the Bnei Ha'ir arrives. Alois HaShachar, Yud Dalet in the morning. You weren't planning on being there. You were planning on going back to your krach, Motzei Tainis Esther sometime, in the middle of the night. You were planning on going back home. Then you're a ben krach. You don't do anything on your Dalet. You keep Tes Vav like you always do every year. Even if you miss your car ride and you end up being in the ear on your Dalet, you still don't keep Purim. Because you didn't become a ben ear. Why? because that wasn't your kavanah. Your kavanah was not to be there. You just ended up there. That doesn't make you a ben ir. Now, let's chazer all of this iber in the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah is basically going to give us 4 different scenarios. And in the 4 different scenarios, we're going to see this rule play out. But again, even before we go to the Mishnah Berurah, I just want to point out to you again how you have to teach the words of the Mechaber. Let's turn back to Kuf Nun Beis Amud Aleph, and I'm just going to read the beginning of the Mechaber again. Ben Ir Shahalach Lekrach. Somebody who lives in an open city who traveled to a krach. He traveled to a closed city. Oy ben krach, or somebody who lives in a walled city, Shahalach Le'ir, who traveled to an open city. If his kavanah was to go back home, when? Bisman kriya, before the time the Iker Zman of Mikra Megillah arrives at the place that he traveled to. So the Ben Ir Shahalach Lekrach, his plan was to be back in the Ir before Alois HaShachar of Tesvav. The Ben Ir Shahalach the Ben Krach Shahalach Le'ir, his plan was to be back home in the Krach before Alois HaShachar at Yud Daled. Okay, that's how we have to teach it. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Let's turn back to Kuf Nun Beis Amud Aleph, bottom line. Ois cut Yud Beis. Ben Ir Shahalach Lekrach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Sif Zeh Hu Lashon HaRambam. This sif is essentially pulled directly from the Lashon of the Rambam. Umipnei sherabi miskashim b'sif hazeh, since many people find this sif exceptionally difficult, muchrach ani lahachriv hadibur ktsas. The Chavetz Chaim says, I need to expand on what the Mechaber wrote, what the Mechaber took from the Rambam. Uneva'aroi, and I will explain it, kifi mashe pershuhu hamagid va'kesef mishnah. And I'm going to explain it based on the Magid Mishnah and the Kesef Mishnah. V'chein mashma mehagra. And the gra in the Biur Hagra also is mashma in alignment with the way the Chavetz Chaim says he is going to explain the Mechaber. First says the Chavetz Chaim, utzrichen anu leida shloisha dvarim. The first thing that we have to know is we have to accept and understand 3 klolim, 3 rules. Aleph, the first one is, if you become a resident of an open city, that's what it means. If you are a resident of an open city, afilu yoim echad, even on a temporary basis, you took an Airbnb, so you're a resident of an open city even for 1 day. Okay, this doesn't mean that you became a resident for 30 days and you're paying taxes. No, you're a resident even for 1 day. You become the resident of an open city. You have a house, you live in a krach, you live in a walled city. For 30 years, you've been keeping Purim on Tesvav. But this year, you're a guest in a prazi, you're a guest in an open city. Even if you're only going to be there for 1 day, you are a prazi. Purim for you this year is Yodalad. V'chein, and similarly, lahepech, the other way around. Imushayach limukafin, if you become a resident of a walled city, afilu yom echad, even for 1 day, karei mukaf, you're now the resident of a walled city. V'karei b'tesvav. And Purim for you this year is Shushan Purim, is Tesvav. That's rule number 1. Rule number 1, a change of residence, even for 1 day, is effective, and you become a resident of that type of town. Rule number 2, Beis. When we look at Purim, there has to be a time stamp on Purim whereby we say that's the critical moment that makes you a resident of the type of town that you're in. There's a certain point during the 24 hours of Purim that's the bar. If you're in that type of town at that point, that's what makes you a resident of that type of town. What time is that? Says the Mishnah Berurah, rule number 2, Zman Kriya Hu Iker Bayoim. The first thing you have to know is that when we speak about Zman Mikra Megillah, the Iker Zman Mikra Megillah is the time of Mikra Megillah by Yom. Not Mikra Megillah by night, Mikra Megillah by Yom. That's the Iker. V'kevan shahaya ba'arei aprozos b'hascholas hayom yudalid. So if you're located in a prozi at the beginning of the day of Yudalid, the day, not the night. If you're located in a prozi at the beginning of the day of Yudalid, that's Alois HaShachar, Yudalid in the morning, Kairebi Yudalid. You are now a prozi, and your chiyuv of Mikra Megillah is now on Yudalid. V'chein kahai gavna le'inyan mukafim b'yom tesvav. And the reverse is also true. If you're located in an ir mukaf chayma mimais Yeshua ben Nun at Alois HaShachar tesvav in the morning, that makes you a ben krach. And your chiyuv is now going to be on tesvav. So again, rule number one, a change of residence even for one day is effective to make you a prozi or a ben krach. The ikar time, the time that's going to determine your residency in either type of town, is the ikar zman chiyuv mikra megillah, which the Chavetz Chaim says is the zman chiyuv mikra megillah by day, which is Alois HaShachar and Yudalid for a ben ir, and Alois HaShachar of Tesvav for a ben krach. Rule number 3. Zman kriya shekaisav ha'mechaber. When the Mechaber wrote on the top line here on Kuf Nun Beis Amid Beis, Im hayadaitay lachzer l'mikaymai bizman kriya, what he means is Hainu zman kriyas hamakayim shehu bay ata. He's referring to the ikar zman of Mikra Megillah at the place where you are now. So what the Mechaber means, when the Mechaber says, if your kavana was that you're going to return home before the Zman Mikra Megillah, he means you're a ben ir who had kavana to return back to your open city before the Ikar Zman Mikra Megillah arrives for the krach, for the walled city that you're in now, which is Alois HaShachar Tesvav in the morning. Lo Zman sheyatza misham. He doesn't mean the Zman Mikra Megillah of your hometown that you left. He means the Ikar Zman Mikra Megillah of your destination where you are now. Va'ata, and now, based on the understanding of these three klalim, these three rules, nevares asif, I will explain sif hey in the mechaber, keseder, in order, b'chol prat b'fnei atzmai, in detail, capturing each scenario. That's what he means b'chol prat b'fnei atzmai, on his own. So now what the Mishnah Berurah is going to do is, he's going to take the cases of the Mechaber and he's going to break them down. Scenario number 1. Ben ir shahalach lekrach. You have somebody who lives in an open city. So his chiyuv is usually on Yodalid. Ben ir shahalach lekrach. He traveled now to a krach. He traveled to a walled city. In a walled city, the chiyuv is usually on Tesvav. So let's say in the scenario that I gave you, this is a ben ir who usually lanes on Yudalid. On Tainis Esther, on Yud Gimel, he traveled to a krach, and now he's in a krach. Okay, let's say he plans to be back in his ir. He plans to be back in his Yudalid city before Alois HaShachar on Tesvav. Let's see it in the words of the Mishnah Berurah. Ben ir, somebody who lives in an open city. So his chiyuv of Purim is usually on Yodalid. Shahalach lekrach, he traveled to a walled city, let's say on Tainis Esther. Im hayadaitoi be'es nisiyasai, if when he traveled his kavana was lachzar l'mekaymai, to go back home to his open city, bizman kriya, at the time of Mikra Megillah. What time is that? Ritzaynai loymar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Bizman Kriya Shel Tesvav. He plans on being back in his open city before Alois HaShachar on Tesvav. So he's going to be in the krach for the entire Yudalid. He lives in a Yudalid city. He went to a krach. His plan is that he's going to be in the krach for the whole Yudalid. But Matzah Yudalid, he's going to go back home to his open city. So he's not planning on being in the walled city, Tes Vav, in the morning, when the Zman Mikra Megillah arrives for the krach. He's not planning on being there. He's planning on going back home, Motzi Yodalid. He's not planning on being in the krach, Tes Vav, in the morning. Even if he finds out that his ride home was canceled, so now it turns out that he is going to be in the krach, Tes Vav, in the morning, Alois HaShachar, but he wasn't planning on being there. Gam al Yom Tes Vav, Mikamakim, nevertheless, Einoi Nikra B'Shem Mukaf, he's not called a Ben Krach, V'Kairei B'Yom Yodalid B'Yosef Krach. He lanes Megillah on Yodalid in the krach. So again, basically, this is ultimately it's simple. This guy is a Ben Ir. He lives in a Yodalid city. He traveled to a krach. He traveled to a Tes Vav city. But his kavanah when he traveled was, he's going to be in the krach for Yodalid, but Matzah Yodalid, he's going back home to the Ir. So was he planning on being in the krach, Tes Vav, in the morning when the Zman Mikra Megillah arrives for the krach? No, he wasn't planning on being there. Therefore, he's not a Ben Krach. He's a Ben Ir. He has to lay Megillah on Yodalid. So comes Yodalid, he lays the Megillah at night, he lays the Megillah in the morning, Al's ding, he's having a wonderful Purim, he's planning on going home, Matzi Purim, that's Matzi Yodalid, he's planning on going home to his Ir. Meantime, all the other Bnei HaKrach are looking at him like he's crazy. What's this guy doing? He's keeping Purim. It's Yodalid, it's not Tes Vav, but he's a Ben Ir. He keeps Yodalid, he keeps Purim on Yodalid. Now suddenly his ride is canceled. Turns out he's going to be in the krach tomorrow morning. He's going to be in the krach, Tes Vav, in the morning, when everybody else is laning Megillah. Does he lane Megillah? No. Even though he's there. Why? Because he didn't become a Ben Krach. Why didn't he become a Ben Krach? Because his kavanah was not to be there at Alois HaShachar Tes Vav in the morning, and that's enough not to make him a Ben Krach. That was scenario number one. Scenario number two. Aval, however, in Be'ez Nisiyasai, if when he traveled from the Ir to the krach, he wasn't planning on going home to the Ir. He went to the krach on Yud Gimel, and he was planning on being in the krach, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalid, Tes Vav. Maybe he was planning on going home to the Ir, Tes Vav, in the afternoon. But Tes Vav Alois HaShachar, he was planning on being in the krach. Well, then he's a Ben Krach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if when he traveled to the krach, he didn't have in mind to leave the krach until after the Zman Mikra Megillah of Tes Vav in the morning, which is the Zman Mikra Megillah for the Bnei HaKrach, Tahainu b'boiker shel Tes Vav, she'az kfar hu Zman HaKriya, az chalal of shemukaf. Now he's called a Ben Krach. V'kairi imahin b'yom Tes Vav. So he's going to keep Tes Vav. He's going to lay Megillah on Tes Vav. Even if he goes back home. Very interesting case. Again, this is a Ben Ir. He traveled to the krach. He's planning on being in the krach on Tes Vav, so he's a Ben Krach. He's got to lay Megillah on Tes Vav. But a strange thing happened. He was planning on davening at the 8 o'clock minyan. Tes Vav morning, he was planning on davening at the 8 o'clock minyan and hearing Megillah at the 8 o'clock minyan. He overslept. He got a little too tipsy the night before. So he missed the 8 o'clock minyan. Then he missed the 9 o'clock minyan. Then he chapped the 10 o'clock minyan, but there was no Baal Keret to lay in the Megillah. Now it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on the afternoon of Tes Vav, and he still hasn't heard the Megillah, and now it's time for him to get his ride back home to his Ir. So he goes back home to his open city. You know what he's got to do? He's got to lay Megillah. In his open city, he has to lay Megillah on Tes Vav. Because even though now he's located in an open city, for this year he was a Ben Krach. Why? Because he was in the Krach, Tes Vav at Alois Shachar, when the Chiv Mikra Megillah of Yom arrived. He was there with intent. He was there and he planned to be there. So he's a Ben Krach. I don't care that now he's in an Ir. He's a ben krach. He's got to learn Megillah. His Chiyuv Megillah is on Tesvav. So Kairei Sham, he's going to learn Megillah on Tesvav in his ear. If he hadn't yet learned yet in the krach. Scenario number 3. Now let's go to the flip side. Instead of talking about a ben ir shahalach lekrach, let's talk about a ben krach shahalach leir. So we have 2 scenarios within that scenario. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Vata nevar asif le'inyofen hasheni. Dahainu beben krach, somebody who lives in a walled Tezvav city, shahalach leir, who travels to an open Yodalit city. So it depends. Im haya daitoi be'es nisiyasai. If his kavana when he traveled was lachzar limud, to go back to his krach bisman kriya, he was planning on being back in his krach before the zman kriya of the ear. When's the zman kriya of the ear? Alois hashachar and Yodalit. So this guy traveled to an ear on Tainus Esther. He was planning on going back to his krach when Motzei Tainus Esther. In the middle of the night, Tainus Esther, he was planning on going back home to his krach. He was not planning on being in the ear, in the open city, by Alois HaShachar, Yud Dalet in the morning, when their Zman Mikra Megillah arrives. He wasn't planning on being there. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. He was planning on going back home bisman kriya at the time of the chiyuv of Mikra Megillah, dahainu, which is sheyachzor misham b'leil Yodalit. He was planning on going home Motzei Tainus Esther, that's the night going into Yodalit, koydem sheyot irayim, before Alois HaShachar Yodalit morning, to Zman Kriya, which is the Zman Kriya for the Bnei Ha'ir. Va'af shel b'soif haya shenesakef v'lo chazar. Even if he missed his ride, and he ends up being in the ear at Alois HaShachar Yodalit morning, kairoi kim kaimai. He's a ben krach, so he lanes like his hometown. Dahainu b'yom Tesvav. So he's in the ear. He does not keep Purim. He does not keep Purim. He keeps Purim on Tesvav. Why? Because even though he's in an ear now on Yodalit, he was not planning on being there at Alois HaShachar Yodalit in the morning. So he never got the din of a ben ir. He retained the din of his hometown. He's a ben krach and he keeps Purim on Tesvav. Avol, finally we get to scenario number 4. Avol, however, but if this ben krach traveled to the ear and he intended on being in the ear at Alois HaShachar Yodalit in the morning, he becomes a ben ear and he has to hear Megillah on the 14th. This is what the Mechaber means when he says therefore, even if later in the day on the 14th, he went back to his hometown and he didn't hear Megillah yet, funny, right? He went to the ear, he planned on being in the ear, Alois HaShachar Yodalit morning. He was in the ear, Alois HaShachar Yodalit morning, but he didn't hear Megillah. Now he goes home to the krach. Now everybody looks at him, oh, good, you're here for Shushan Purim. Nope. This year, my Purim is Yodalit, because I was in an ear. Alois HaShachar Yodalit in the morning with Kavana. So I became a ben ear. I got to learn Megillah now. Yodalit, here in the krach. I got to learn Megillah on Yodalit. Doing Nikra Paras ben Yoma. Because of the Taz ultimately writes, the Chol Zeh Dafka, just realized that this only applies im hoya sham be'ir b'tchilas hayom. You only get the din of that city if you indeed were there at Alois HaShachar. Avalim chazal kaimai shu krach koydem hayoim lo yimoyel ma shechasha b'tchila lo yos be'ir be'ez kriyas ha'ir. What the Taz is saying like this is, we see how important kavana is, but kavana alone isn't enough to give you the din of your destination. In other words, if you're a ben krach and you traveled to an ear on Yud Gimel, on Tainus Esther, and you traveled with the kavana that you're going to be there at Alois HaShachar Yodalit in the morning, if you taka are there at Alois HaShachar Yudalin in the morning, you become a Ben Ir. And this year Purim for you is Yudalin. But what if your plans changed? You planned on being there at Alois HaShachar Yudalin in the morning. But then somebody came to you and said, oh, I heard you need a ride back to Shushan. You need a ride back to your walled city. I have a ride for you tonight. So the guy says, oh, great, I'll take my ride. Now he goes back home. Don't think that he's a Ben Ir because his kavanah was to be in the Ir tomorrow morning. If he's not there, he's not there. If he physically is not in the Ir at Alois HaShachar Yudalin in the morning, then he doesn't get the din of a Ben Ir. He retains the din of a Ben Krach. So says the Taz. Okay. Wow. What a mouthful. Okay. Now let's go to the Ramah. Second line down near the end of the line. Kuftan Beis Amid Beis. I go. Vimu b'midbar b'sfina. Let's say somebody is out in a midbar. So he's not in a krach. He's not in an ear. Vimu b'midbar oy b'sfina. If somebody finds himself in a midbar or on a ship. Kairei b'yom yundalid k'may roi va'olam. So if you have a Ben Krach who finds himself out on a cruise on Purim, so he's not in a Krach, he's not in a Kvar, he's on a cruise ship, the default Purim is Yud-Dalet. So says the Ramah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut Yud Gimel v'im midbar, afilu im hum im krachin, even though this fellow is a Ben Krach, if he finds himself on a cruise ship or in a midbar, the default Purim is Yud-Dalet, because that is Yud-Dalet for Roiv Ha'olam. All right, I hoped to go a little bit further, but I guess we're going to have to stop here because it's already long. So we'll stop with Sivav. Maybe I'll try to squeeze in an extra shiur just to make sure that we don't chas v'chalila fall behind. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's for first parnassah sheduchim for all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Girl Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.